out grocery shopping with my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. When I saw that the bill came to $850, they both said they had forgotten their money. I just smiled. Hold on a second. I have to do something first. Welcome to my story. Before I reveal every shocking detail of how I finally exposed their lies and took my life back, please take a second to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support is what keeps this channel going and helps us bring more real, dramatic stories to light. Now, let's go back to where the illusion finally shattered that fateful afternoon in the supermarket. That day, I went to the supermarket with my mother-in-law, Susan, and my sister-in-law, Natalie. I thought it would be a normal weekend shopping afternoon, but it turned out to be the last time they would believe they could take advantage of me so easily. Just like over the last 4 years, from the moment we walked into the upscale department store downtown, the largest one in the city center, I knew something wasn't right. Susan and her daughter pushed the cart straight toward the gourmet products section. Without even looking at the price, Natalie grabbed one package of premium artisanal charcuterie after another, high-end canned delicacies, while Susan tested niche perfumes worth over $100 as if she were buying a bunch of parsley at the farmer's market. But they didn't stop there. A set of French brand cookware landed right in the cart, followed by a designer bag that I knew wouldn't cost less than $500. Standing behind them, I watched the cart get fuller and fuller, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I gently reminded her, keeping my voice at a normal volume. "Mom, if you're buying this much, I assume you brought enough money, right?" Susan stopped and turned to shoot me a look as sharp as a knife. "What are you insinuating with that question, Emily? Are we short on money in this family?" Natalie, right beside her, let out a mocking little laugh with a tone loaded with hidden meaning. "Don't worry, sister-in-law. You earn a good salary for a reason." Hearing that phrase, I knew they already had it all planned out. I didn't say anything else. I followed her in silence to the register. The cashier scanned each item. The machine beeped endlessly, and the receipt that came out was almost as long as my arm. The girl looked at the screen and read out loud, "That will be $857.40. I saw several people in the line behind us open their eyes wide. $850 for a supermarket run is not a small amount for anyone. I crossed my arms and waited. I waited for Susan to pull out her wallet, for Natalie to open the banking app on her phone. But no, Susan pretended to rummage through her purse for a few seconds and then blurted out completely naturally, "Oh, what a disaster. I left my money at home." Natalie backed her up instantly, without the slightest hint of shame on her face, and I didn't bring my card. They both turned to look at me with an expression so natural, so predetermined, as if it were obvious that I had to pay. If it had been like before, I probably would have sighed and taken out my card. But that day, I didn't flinch. I looked straight at the cashier and with a clear voice said, "Excuse me, could you set this purchase aside for a moment?" The young woman was a bit surprised, but nodded. I turned to my mother-in-law and sister-in-law and said slowly, word for word, "I am going to step out and do something first." Susan frowned. "Do what? You can't do it later?" "Just pay now." I just looked at her. Without answering, I walked with a straight back toward the supermarket exit without looking back. Behind me, I vaguely heard Natalie's voice calling me, "Emily, what are you doing?" But I didn't stop. The automatic doors opened and a gust of warm air hit my face, but inside I felt a strange coldness. 4 years, as a daughter-in-law. How many times had I found myself at a checkout counter like this? How many times had I told myself to let it go? But not today. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and hailed a taxi that was nearby. The driver asked me, "Where to?" I answered dryly, "Home." As the car started moving, I looked out the window. The inside of the supermarket was still brightly lit, and my mother-in-law and sister-in-law must have still been in there, planted right by the register, with an $850 bill and the curious stares of everyone around them. For the first time in my married life, I left them to face the consequences of their actions alone. Sitting in the taxi, I didn't feel fear or regret. I only felt that I had just done something I should have done a long time ago. The money wasn't the biggest problem. Maybe I could have paid the $850, but the way they looked at me, the way they took it for granted that I had to pay, was what I could no longer swallow. When I got home, I opened the door and walked in feeling a strange calm. My phone was vibrating nonstop. It was undoubtedly Susan and Natalie. I didn't answer. I left my bag on the table and took a deep breath. Today I hadn't yelled, I hadn't insulted anyone, I hadn't made a scene at the supermarket. I simply turned around. But it was precisely that gesture they didn't expect. I knew that in a few minutes their anger would explode, but I also knew that from the moment I walked away from that register, nothing in this family would ever be the same. And that $850 bill to me wasn't just money, it was a boundary. The boundary between a submissive daughter-in-law and a woman who knows how to protect herself. I sat in my familiar living room. The ticking of the wall clock sounded rhythmic, but in my head, many images from the past echoed. When I dared to walk out of that supermarket, I knew I could never go back to being the good daughter-in-law from before. In reality, I was never good in the sense of being submissive. I only kept quiet because I thought silence kept the peace in the home, but the more I stayed quiet, the more they considered it their right to walk all over me. My name is Emily. I've been married to Ryan for exactly 4 years. The day I walked into this house as his wife, I felt that my mother-in-law didn't like me. It wasn't declared hatred from the beginning, but a cold disdain. A disdain in her eyes, in her tone of voice, in the way she always found a way to remind me that as a daughter-in-law, I needed to know my place. Susan used to repeat a phrase like a mantra. In front of me, in front of relatives, in front of neighbors. A daughter-in-law must sacrifice for her husband's family. Back then, newly married, young, and naive, I only knew how to force a smile. I thought it was just something the older generation said, that if I tried hard to be good, time would soften her. I work at a bank, a stable job with an income that, while not a fortune, was enough to live a decent life. I used to think that having a career and being financially independent would earn me at least some respect, but no. Just a few weeks after the wedding, Susan called me over with a soft but authoritative voice and said, "In this house, we have a family fund. Now that you are working, bring your salary here. I will manage it so everything is handled reasonably." Naively, I asked, "Sure. How much should I contribute each month?" She answered, as if it were nothing. "Bring me your pay stub. I'll look at it and I'll decide." The phrase sounded like care, but in reality, it was control. The first month, I transferred almost my entire salary, keeping only a little for commuting and lunches. I told myself it was a contribution. Ryan, who was right there, only said one thing. "Listen to Mom, she manages it best." I looked at my husband, wanting to ask him if he didn't find it strange, but then I figured he was used to the rules of his house, that he was afraid of upsetting his mother. I gave in. I thought keeping the harmony was what mattered, but over time I realized that this supposed family fund was not transparent at all. My money went in punctually, but where it went was a mystery. One month I asked my mother-in-law for a few $100s to buy things for the house. She frowned. "Why are you spending so much?" Another time, I needed money for a professional certification course. She sighed. "A married woman. Why do you want to keep studying? Save that money for the house." I heard that and felt a lump in my throat. It was my money, earned with my hard work, but to use it, I had to ask for permission. And when I asked, they scrutinized me as if I were a parasite. Soon I realized that most of the expenses weren't for the family, but for Natalie. My sister-in-law wasn't working at the time. She said she was job hunting, but I saw her home all day, browsing the internet on her phone, going to coffee shops, and shopping. Natalie liked nice clothes, brand names, getting her nails and hair done. One day she came home, tossed a luxury brand shopping bag on the table, and just by seeing the logo, I knew it cost hundreds of dollars. I asked Ryan, "Where does your sister get the money to buy this?" Ryan shrugged. "I guess Mom gives it to her." I turned to my mother-in-law. Susan just smiled. "The girl is young. She needs to look nice." I insisted. "And that money comes from the family fund?" Mom looked at me with ice-cold eyes. "I manage the money. Why are you asking so many questions?" Once, I made a gentle comment to Natalie because I truly didn't want the family overspending. "Natalie, now that you don't have a job, we should save a little. When you're on your feet, you can buy those things." Natalie opened her eyes wide and let out a sarcastic little laugh. "If you have money, you share it. Being so calculating doesn't suit you, sister-in-law." a phrase said lightly, but it made me understand my place in that house. I wasn't a family member to be respected, but someone with money who was expected to share. I told Ryan everything. I hoped my husband would, at the very least, defend me or tell his mother that things needed to be clear. But Ryan always avoided it. He was afraid of his mother, afraid of confrontation. He feared that every time I opened my mouth, his mother would start crying and accuse him. "Your wife is turning you against me." Ryan used to say, "Don't make a drama out of this. Mom is older. It's just how she is." I heard that phrase so many times. It's just how she is. That sometimes it made me want to laugh. Her way of being was despising her daughter-in-law and treating her money as her own. Yes, I gave in because I loved my husband, because I thought all families had friction, that if I was patient, everything would settle down. But every time I gave in, they took another step forward. After 10 times, they treated me like a walking ATM. It's not that I didn't notice. It's that I didn't want to push things to the point of no return. And from there, I started to change in silence. I stopped arguing, but I started taking notes. I took note of every time they forgot their money, of every amount I had to pull out of my pocket to pay for them. A dinner at a restaurant. Susan forgot her wallet. "Shopping once," Natalie said. "You pay for it, sister-in-law. I'll pay you back at home." No one ever brought it up. I didn't demand it, but I wrote it down. I kept the receipts. I took screenshots of the transfers, not to be petty, but to remind myself they were confusing my kindness with an obligation. There were nights when, lying next to Ryan, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I lived as a wife or as a salaried employee. I came home exhausted from work just to hear passive-aggressive comments, to hand over my paycheck, to watch my money turn into luxuries for others. There was a time when I softened, when I consoled myself thinking it was to help my sister-in-law, but the more I gave her, the more she took it for granted. The more I endured, the bolder my mother-in-law got. I wasn't stupid. I was just waiting for the right moment. A moment so clear that it wouldn't need long explanations. A moment where a single gesture would be enough for them to understand. From now on, I am no longer the one footing the bill, and that moment arrived in the form of a receipt almost 3 feet long at a supermarket checkout. After that night where I wondered if I was a wife or a walking ATM, I began to recall every milestone with painful clarity. Not with resentment, but like someone tracing every knot in the rope that is slowly tightening around their neck. I realized that none of this had become a habit by chance. It started with small, very subtle incidents, very easy to brush off with a let it go. The first time Susan forgot her money was at a dinner in a restaurant. It was a relative's anniversary, and she asked Ryan and me to take her out to dinner so she wouldn't have to cook. I was even glad, thinking it was a sign of harmony. At the restaurant, Susan ordered dishes at lightning speed, without looking at the prices. Baked fish, filet mignon, a seafood platter, and then desserts. Natalie also came, laughing and talking animatedly, repeating, "Mom's treating today. Order whatever you want." Hearing the words "Mom's treating," I felt relieved. When we finished, the waiter brought the check, over $120. I instinctively looked at Susan. She wiped her mouth slowly, rummaged through her purse for a good while, and then let out a sigh as if it were a huge surprise. "Oh, what a disaster! I forgot my wallet." Saying that, she turned to look at me without a hint of apology or shame in her eyes. It was a look that said I was there to solve it. I froze. Ryan, beside me, also tensed up. When I was about to say we could go home and get it, Susan had already calmly passed judgment. "You pay it first, Emily. I'll pay you back at home." I paid, not because I had money to spare, but because I didn't want to make a scene in the middle of the restaurant. I told myself she truly must have forgotten it. At home, I waited. I didn't ask her directly out of fear of seeming stingy. I thought an older person would remember. A day passed, 2, a week. Susan didn't mention a single word, as if that dinner had never existed. And what bothered me most was her attitude. She acted completely normal. She ordered me to do household chores and spoke to me as if it were my duty. That first time was like a test, and I passed it in the exact way they liked best. They understood that I would cave for appearances, for family, out of fear of conflict. From then on, the phrase, "I forgot my wallet," started appearing more frequently. but every time in a different context, so it would be hard for me to say no. The second time wasn't a restaurant, it was Natalie's new phone. That day, Natalie dragged me out shopping with her, saying it was to have fun. I didn't like those outings, but she smiled sweetly. "Come with me, sister-in-law, so I don't get lost." When we got to the store, Natalie picked the latest model, one that at a glance you could tell was expensive. The clerk told her the price, and she didn't even flinch. When it came time to pay, she pretended to open her wallet and frowned. "Wow, I'm $200 short. I must have a limit on my card." Then she turned to me, and even though she kept smiling, her tone was an order. "You pay what's missing, sister-in-law. As soon as we get home, I'll transfer it to you." I stood paralyzed for a few seconds. $200 was not a small amount, but the store was full. The clerk was waiting, and Natalie was acting with astonishing naturalness, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for me to pay for her. I gritted my teeth and paid. Leaving the store, Natalie hugged the phone box, exultant, repeating, "My sister-in-law is the best. How much do you love me?" I heard the word love and felt a chill. What kind of affection assumes that the other person has to spend their money? I waited a week. Since she didn't transfer anything, I sent her a very polite text. "Natalie, the other day I covered what you were short for the phone. Could you transfer it to me, please?" She read it and replied instantly. Her answer left me breathless. "You're charging me, sister-in-law? Is that how you treat your family?" I looked at the screen, and my hands shook with rage. It wasn't an apology or an excuse for the delay. It was an accusation of being cheap. She even added, "You work at a bank. $200 is nothing to you." I told Ryan about the incident. I didn't ask him to scream at his sister in the middle of the living room. I just needed him to say something with common sense. But Ryan sighed with his usual evasive attitude. "Don't make a drama out of this. Natalie is young and impulsive. I'll talk to her." I'll talk to her stretched out indefinitely. Ryan never talked to her, or if he did, it was in passing. Natalie became increasingly shameless. It was my husband's silence that made them despise me even more, because they understood that no matter how outraged I got, I would only complain to Ryan, and Ryan would always choose the easy way out. Every time something like this happened, I felt cornered and gagged by my own actions. It wasn't that they didn't know it bothered me. They knew perfectly well, but they were convinced I wouldn't dare to do anything. And then one day, I overheard a conversation that woke me up completely. I came home from work earlier than usual. As I approached my mother-in-law's bedroom door, I heard Susan and Natalie talking inside. Natalie was laughing. "This time, I want to buy some luxury cosmetics and a new bag," Susan replied instantly. "Get it." "Don't worry about her," Natalie asked again. "What if she complains?" Susan delivered a sentence with a tone as firm as a judge's ruling. "Let Emily pay. She won't dare to do anything." I stood petrified. Not because of the money, but because of how they defined me in a single sentence. She won't dare to do anything. I felt like I had been slapped. During all this time, I had consoled myself, thinking they were oversights, that they didn't do it with malice, but that sentence proved to me that it was all intentional. They discussed it, they planned it, and they put me in the position of the one who simply pays. From that day on, I started separating my accounts. I didn't make a scene, I didn't make declarations, I didn't complain, I simply changed in silence. When I got paid, I first set aside my share and then transferred what I considered fair, instead of handing it all over like before. I knew the day would come when Susan would notice and fly into a rage, but I was no longer afraid, because what I feared most had already happened. They despised me to the point of believing I wouldn't dare defend myself, and I made a very clear decision in my mind, as if signing an oath with myself. The next time they tried the trick of forgetting the money, I wouldn't pay. Not as revenge to vent, but to nip that dangerous habit in the bud. If I didn't cut it off, I would spend the rest of my life paying for other people's lives. I was home without even having washed my hands, and the phone was vibrating constantly, hammering in my ears. The screen showed the names: mother-in-law, Natalie, mother-in-law. Again, I silenced the phone and left it face down on the table. It was strange. For 4 years, every time I felt cornered, I panicked and thought about how to explain everything to calm the waters. But that day, after walking out of the supermarket, My mind was lucid, almost ice cold. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make a scene. I just wanted to resolve things once and for all so that whoever needed to see it would see it with their own eyes. I put on my slippers and went straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. My hand shook a little, not from fear, but from that adrenaline you feel when you decide to cut off something you've endured for far too long. I sat down and looked around the living room, the furniture that was mostly bought with the money I had contributed. I took a deep breath. I knew that if I faltered, if I answered the phone, everything would go back to normal, and they would be even more certain that the phrase, "she won't dare to do anything," was true. I couldn't allow it. I picked up the phone. I didn't call my mother-in-law or Natalie. I dialed Ryan's number. It rang several times. Ryan answered. His voice sounded like he was on the street. "Emily, are you guys done at the supermarket?" His tone was as carefree as if today's grocery run were an unimportant errand. I didn't answer his question. I got straight to the point with a voice so calm it surprised me. "Come to the Whole Foods downtown right now. Your mother and sister have a problem that you need to solve." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Ryan asked with a somewhat irritated tone. I kept my voice firm and serene. "When you get there, you'll know." Ryan was starting to get impatient. "Why so much mystery?" "Mom keeps calling me." Hearing that, I understood they were desperate, but I didn't give Ryan the chance to beat around the bush. I ended it with a soft but definitive sentence. "If you don't come, it will be your problem. I am no longer taking care of it." Having said that, I hung up. Upon hanging up, my heart beat faster. I am not a person who likes to create tense situations, but I knew that if I explained it over the phone, Ryan would try to mediate. He would tell me to pay first and that we would fix it later. And once again, I would become the one who pays for them. I needed Ryan to see the scene with his own eyes. His mother and sister at the register, pretending to have forgotten the money like in a stage play and looking at me as if it were my obligation. I needed him to witness the stares of the people, to hear their comments. Only seeing it in person, he wouldn't be able to deny that they were taking advantage of me. The phone vibrated again. My mother-in-law. I didn't answer. Natalie didn't know they would change tactics. From anger to pleading. From pleading to threats. I ignored it, got up, and paced the living room, trying to keep my breathing steady. In my head, I kept repeating that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was simply refusing to let them take advantage of me. About 10 minutes later, Ryan called back. This time his voice was more urgent. "Emily, where are you? Mom says you left," I answered tersely. "I'm at home." Ryan's breath hitched for a moment, and then he blurted out, "But how could you do that? Mom is in the middle of the supermarket. Everyone is looking at her. Do you want to humiliate her?" I let out a bitter laugh, but in a low voice. "Why don't you ask your mother why she put herself in that situation? I didn't force her to stay there. I simply didn't pay for her." Ryan fell silent for a few seconds. I heard background noise. He was probably walking into the supermarket. Then he lowered his voice. "How much is the bill?" "Quite a lot." "Huh." I answered clearly, word for word. $857. Ryan let out an incredulous, "What?" I knew that number alone would be enough to shock him, because he perfectly understood what his mother and sister had piled into the cart. Ryan lowered his voice even more, trying to stay calm. "You pay it first, and then at home I'll tell Mom to pay you back." I knew he would say that. Ryan still wanted me to be his shield. I didn't argue. I simply replied firmly, "No." Ryan raised his voice. "Don't be so stubborn, Emily. People are staring." My answer was just as serene. "Exactly. People are staring, and that is why you have to go. You are her son and her brother. You solve it." On the other end of the line, I heard Ryan's heavy breathing and the sound of his hurried footsteps. He said, containing his anger, "Mom is very upset. And Natalie, too. Do you plan to leave them stranded there until when?" I answered slowly. "Until you pay, or until they call someone to bring them the money. It is not my responsibility to pay for them." Ryan started to soften, as if feeling cornered. "Emily, what is it that you want?" "I don't know what's going on." I answered him with a very clear sentence. "I want you to see the truth. I want money to be a transparent issue from now on, and I want you to stop asking me to just endure it to keep the peace." Ryan fell silent again. I knew he was at the register, looking at his mother and sister, listening to them, and I wasn't wrong. A few seconds later, he spoke in a very low voice, with a mix of annoyance and embarrassment. "Mom says she really forgot her wallet." I answered instantly, without hesitation. "If she forgot it, let her call someone to bring it to her. If not, let her say so." Ryan was left speechless. I could clearly hear how he felt trapped between two fires, and this time he couldn't use me as a shield. A moment later, my phone vibrated again. It was a text from Natalie. I glanced at it. "Are you crossing the line? Are you trying to make my mother look ridiculous in front of everyone?" I didn't answer immediately. I turned off the screen and set the phone down. I knew the most important thing today wasn't arguing with Natalie. The important thing was that Ryan was there and the truth was unfolding before his eyes, not through my words. I sat on the sofa looking out the window. I didn't feel glee, but I did feel a very clear sensation. This time I wasn't going to protect anyone. I had opened a door for Ryan to walk in and look straight at it, and once he saw it, he wouldn't be able to pretend nothing had happened. When Ryan hung up, I stayed sitting in the living room. I wasn't someone who enjoyed creating public scenes, but if I kept fearing losing face, the only one who would end up dragging her dignity on the floor would be me. Today was the straw that had to break the camel's back, and that $850 bill was that straw. About 20 minutes later, Ryan called back, his voice ragged, as if he had just been running. "Mom says you abandoned her with an $850 bill. Does that seem normal to you?" His question made me smile bitterly. He was asking me if it seemed normal, instead of asking his mother why she had put herself in that situation. I answered bluntly, "I didn't abandon her. I simply didn't pay for her." There was a silence, and then Ryan lowered his voice, restraining himself. "But people are looking at her. She is so embarrassed." I didn't want to argue, I said with every word clear so he couldn't ignore it. "You go. Your mother and sister need you to pay $850, Ryan replied frustratedly. "You say it like it's easy. Where am I supposed to get $850 right now?" I counterattacked instantly. Then where were they planning to get it from when they filled the cart? "If you don't have it, I have even less of a reason to have it." Ryan stayed quiet. I knew his silence wasn't due to a lack of arguments, but because he was trapped in a hole that his own family had dug. For 4 years he had gotten used to me carrying the whole load, and now he felt lost seeing that I had dropped that burden. I could hear the murmur of people in the background, the beeping of other registers. Ryan was already there. He said quietly, "Mom insists she forgot her wallet. If she forgot it, let her call someone to bring it to her." "I haven't forbidden her from doing that," I replied. Ryan sighed. "And Natalie says she forgot her card too." I let out a dry laugh. "Sure, they're going to make an almost $900 purchase and both of them forget their money. Does that seem logical to you?" Ryan choked on his own words. I didn't need his answer. I just needed him to realize it himself. Just at that moment, I received a message from Natalie. I opened it, just as expected. "You are crossing the line." I looked at the sentence for a few seconds and replied with a single line, without adding or taking anything away. "Crossing the line is making others pay your bills." I sent the message and turned off the screen. I didn't want to get into a text fight with people like Natalie. The more you argue, the more she likes it. Because she can twist the story to look like the victim and make me look like the bad guy. I put the phone down, but a few minutes later, Natalie wrote again. This time, her tone shifted from pleading to threatening. "Because of you, my mother is making a fool of herself. People are staring and recording videos. You won't stop until you destroy this family." I didn't answer. I just thought that the family isn't destroyed because I refuse to pay a bill, but because they consider it my obligation to pay it. The fracture had existed for a long time. Today it had simply become visible. A while later, Ryan called again, his voice tense, as if he were trapped between two walls. "Emily, listen to me. Why don't you just wire me the money? I'll pay, and we'll talk at home." Hearing that, I felt an icy chill. It was the same tactic as always, just with different words. I asked him, "Do you understand what I am doing?" Ryan answered, almost begging. "I understand, but people are staring right now." I interrupted him. Exactly. People are staring, and you're worried that they're staring at your mother, not that for 4 years they've been staring at how they took advantage of your wife. Ryan fell silent. I kept my voice calm, but every word I said was something I had swallowed for 4 years. Ryan, I'm telling you for the last time. I am not wiring anything. I am not paying. If your mother really forgot her money, let her call someone to bring it to her. If she doesn't have the money, let her put things back and only pay for what's necessary. The supermarket has its rules. I am not doing anything illegal. Suddenly, Ryan yelled, "By doing this, you're backing her into a corner." I answered instantly with a firm voice. I am not backing her into a corner. I simply stopped carrying her. She walked herself into a dead end, thinking she could buy whatever she wanted and that there would always be someone to pay. I heard Susan's shrill voice in the background. She must have been standing next to Ryan. Tell her to get back here right now. What a daughter-in-law, abandoning her mother-in-law like a beggar. Hearing that, I laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. She called me the one abandoning her like a beggar, when she was the one standing there refusing to pay. I didn't speak directly to her. I spoke to Ryan with a definitive tone. Did you hear that? Your mother is still blaming me. Doesn't she see her mistake? Why do you want me to come back? Ryan took a deep breath. His voice faded. Emily, calm down. I am very calm, I replied. So calm that it's the reason I haven't gone back. I didn't argue in the supermarket and I didn't make a scene in front of strangers. I simply left. Ryan stayed silent. I knew this silence was because he had seen it with his own eyes. He had heard his mother and sister with his own ears, and for the first time, he couldn't sugarcoat the story. I was sitting there thinking everything would settle down, but the phone rang again. An unknown number. I answered. It was the cashier's voice, polite but uncomfortable. Excuse me, are you the lady who was with the 2 women earlier? I'm calling to ask about the purchase of over $850 that we have on hold. Are you coming back to pay for it? I looked at my hands and answered concisely. The ones shopping were my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law. Please proceed according to your store policies. The cashier hesitated. It's just that the ladies are causing a scene and we had to call the manager, I said firmly. Call him. I stand by my words. I hung up and leaned back on the sofa. I could imagine the tension in the supermarket. If the bill wasn't paid, they wouldn't take the groceries, and if it was already scanned, canceling it also required a process. The people in line would be annoyed. The manager would have had to come down. The stares of others must have been driving Susan crazy because she loved to boss people around at home, but outside she hated being seen as a troublemaker. Natalie was probably pouting and blaming me for everything to maintain her victim image, but oddly, I no longer felt remorse. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt I was handing responsibility back to whom it belonged. Today's $850 was their bill, not mine. If they had the confidence to fill the cart, they should have the capacity to pay for it. If they didn't have it, they should know when to stop. And if they did it on purpose to force me to pay, today it was their turn to taste the feeling of being pressured. Right there in front of everyone, with no one to back them up. Suddenly I remembered the sentence I heard Susan say, "Let Emily pay. She won't dare to do anything." I smiled to myself and said, like a declaration that no one needed to hear, today, I did dare. For the first time in 4 years of marriage, I felt like I was no longer cornered, and I knew perfectly well that the supermarket incident was only the beginning. What would scare them wasn't the $850, but that starting today, I wouldn't give them a single chance to disrespect me ever again. Ryan came home when it was almost dark. I heard the door slam, the dull thud of his shoes hitting the floor, and his direct footsteps toward the living room. Without a greeting, as soon as he saw me on the sofa, he snapped with a face red with rage. "You humiliated my mother in front of everyone. Are you happy?" His voice was a mix of anger and embarrassment, the voice of someone who feels publicly humiliated and takes that frustration out on their partner. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at him for a second. I pulled a stack of papers out of my bag that I had already prepared. I placed it on the coffee table and slid it toward him. I said calmly, without raising my voice, "Look at this, and then we'll talk." Ryan stopped. Maybe he didn't expect me to react without begging or giving explanations. He frowned, grabbed the papers, and skimmed through them quickly, just to get it over with. But as he turned the pages, his pace slowed down. They were bank statements I had printed, with all the dates and descriptions of the transfers I had made to the supposed family fund over 4 years. There were months when I transferred with clockwork punctuality, others where I added more because Susan said there was an unexpected expense, and others where I did it urgently because Natalie needed money. I watched as Ryan turned each page. His gaze wavered. The accumulated figures weren't a few $100s, but a total sum that would make anyone shudder. He looked up with a hoarse voice. "Where did you get this?" "From my bank account. From every time I transferred money. I saved everything," I answered. Ryan looked again at the total sum I had highlighted in red. The money I had contributed to the family fund exceeded $50,000. He swallowed hard. I clearly saw his Adam's apple bob. I rested my elbow on the sofa. My voice was cold, but not accusatory. "That is what I have contributed. How much have your mother and sister contributed?" Ryan was speechless. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew the answer would shame him. Natalie had no stable income. Susan had a small business, but her personal money never transparently entered the fund. Being honest, that fund was nourished mostly by my money. But the decision-making power belonged to my mother-in-law. Seeing himself exposed, Ryan got angry, slapped the papers on the table, and raised his voice. "Don't talk about money like that. We are a family." I looked at him and let out a short, bitter laugh. Family is not an excuse to suck the blood out of others. Ryan opened his eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe I dared to speak so directly. He tried to reply, but didn't know where to start. With the statements right in front of him, I continued in the same tone. Today's bill wasn't $850, it was my limit. I've endured 4 years. Today, I said enough. Ryan slapped his thigh, frustrated and powerless. "But you could have just said so. Doing it like this, you humiliated my mother. People were staring, they were recording videos. You know that." I frowned. "I know, but I ask you, does it hurt you that people were looking at your mother? Yet for 4 years, while I paid and endured humiliations, did you look?" Ryan fell silent. His silence was heavy because he knew I was right. Right at that moment, the door opened. Susan walked in with a flushed face, her eyes bloodshot. She didn't look at Ryan. She walked straight to me with a sour tone. "What a daughter-in-law, abandoning her mother-in-law at the supermarket. You still have the nerve." I stood up without avoiding her gaze and said slowly, "The nerve is what you just left at the supermarket checkout." Susan stood paralyzed for an instant and then exploded. "Insolent. You dare speak to your mother-in-law like that?" I didn't yell. I simply asked her, every word clear. "You call me insolent for not paying for you. What do you call putting almost $900 in a cart and then saying you forgot your money?" Susan flinched. Maybe she didn't expect me to dare use the phrase, "forgot your money" directly. She turned to Ryan, changing her tone instantly, crying and wailing. "Look at your wife, son. She humiliated me in front of everyone. I am an older woman. I don't understand cards or any of those things. I really forgot." I looked at Ryan and then at Susan. I said a sentence that froze the room. "If you really forgot it, why didn't you call someone to bring you the money? Why did you stay there waiting for your daughter-in-law to pay?" Susan spat back. "I didn't tell you to pay. I told you to front it, and I'd pay you back at home." I laughed this time, openly. "You've told me many times you'd pay me back. I have yet to see you do it a single time." Ryan turned to me with an expression of anger and shame. "Emily, why are you talking like this? We can discuss things calmly." I interrupted him with a firm voice. "There is no calm anymore. I didn't make a scene at the supermarket out of respect for Mom, but at home, I speak clearly." Susan lunged toward me, pointing her finger at me. "What is it you want? For me to get on my knees and beg your forgiveness?" I stared right at her. "I don't need you to get on your knees. I need clarity and respect." Just at that moment, Natalie arrived, her face still contorted. She walked in pretending to cry with a broken voice, but her eyes shot me looks of pure hatred. "Because of you." People laughed at my mother. "Are you satisfied?" I turned to her. My voice was icy. "You'll be satisfied when you shop with other people's money and mock them on top of it." I've only put a stop to that." Natalie changed her tone instantly, adopting the role of the victim. "What do you mean? I didn't force you to pay." My mother really forgot. I didn't play her game. I turned to Ryan and asked him a direct question. "You've heard everything. Do you still think this is a misunderstanding?" "No." Ryan hesitated, looking at his mother, his sister, and the bank statements on the table. He opened his mouth to say something, but closed it. I picked up the papers and tapped them gently against the table, as if sealing a deal. "Starting today, I am not transferring any more money into that fund. The money I earn, I manage. As for household expenses, whoever wants to buy something, put up their own money. If Mom or Natalie genuinely need help, I am willing to help if there is a clear reason. But for getting your money to force me to pay, that is over," Susan screamed. "You dare cut off the fund? Are you living in this house as if it were yours?" I answered dryly. "Exactly. I live in this house, but I don't live to be taken advantage of." The atmosphere in the living room was suffocating. Ryan, in the middle of everything, was pale. For the first time unable to use his usual, "just let it go," to settle the matter. And I, even though my heart was pounding, knew I had just crossed a line, the line of silence. And when the silence is broken, what comes next isn't pleasant for anyone. When Susan heard me say I wouldn't transfer money to the fund anymore, her face turned purple, but a few seconds later she changed tactics. She began to cry inconsolably with a trembling voice, as if she were a huge victim. "I've taken care of her for 4 years, and now she counts every penny. What a shame my son married a woman like this." Natalie beside her chimed in, sobbing at just the right moment. Ryan looked at his mother, and then at me, clearly inclined to take her side. As always, but this time I wasn't going to let the story turn into the insolent daughter-in-law and the suffering mother-in-law. I stood my ground and looked at Susan, saying emphatically, "You took care of your son, not me." The sentence knocked the wind out of her. Susan stopped crying abruptly, as if she were choking. Natalie also stopped, blinking rapidly. Ryan frowned. "Emily, that sounded really harsh." I turned to my husband. "Harsh? It's the truth, Ryan. In 4 years, have you ever asked me how I was doing? Or have you only asked me to endure it to keep the peace?" Susan tried to start yelling again, but I didn't give her the chance to drag the conversation into emotional territory. I walked over to the TV stand, grabbed the remote, and turned on the screen. I took out my phone, opened the banking app, and with a calm voice said, "Since everyone likes to talk about what's fair today, let's talk numbers." Ryan startled. "What are you doing?" "Showing you that family fund that Mom says she manages so well," I answered. I cast my phone to the TV, and the transaction history of the family fund account appeared on the screen. Ryan stood petrified. He didn't expect me to have access. I looked at him and explained, "I opened this account back in the day. The online banking registration is still linked to my phone number. I don't have time to monitor every expense, but I have the right to know where the money I contribute goes," Susan yelled. "Are you spying on me?" I turned and offered a half smile. "No, I just logged back in to see the truth on the screen." I scrolled the history down to a line I had already flagged. A transfer for a considerable amount that was clearly visible. $12,000. The recipient, Natalie's personal account. I pointed at the screen. My voice was icy. "Here, $12,000 transferred to Natalie's account." The air in the living room became unbreathable. Ryan stared fixedly at the screen with his eyes wide open, and then turned sharply to Natalie. "What is this?" Natalie was pale, motionless. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Susan rushed to intervene with a sharp voice. "It's house money." I lent it to her. "What's so weird about that?" Ryan replied, raising his voice at his mother for the first time. "You lend her $12,000 and you don't tell me anything? Whose money is that?" Susan, cornered, looked away and then yelled like usual, "It's money from this house, I manage it, and I don't have to give explanations to anyone." I let out a dry laugh. Not out of smugness, but because it was exactly what I expected. I looked at Ryan and said slowly, "Did you hear that? She doesn't have to give explanations to anyone. If she doesn't give explanations to you, her own son, what do you think I am in this house? Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but was left speechless. He looked at the statements on the table, the TV screen, then at his mother, and his gaze began to crack. Natalie, catching her breath, stammered. It was a loan to invest. I was going to pay it back. I tilted my head. Invest in what? Natalie tried to sound convincing. In a business. I pressed her, leaving no escape. What business? Say it. Natalie hesitated. Her eyes searched for an exit. I wanted to open an aesthetics clinic. I let out a bitter laugh. Or maybe you lost all the money day trading, and now you're trying to cover the hole with the family fund. Natalie's eyes widened. Don't slander me. I shrugged. I'm not slandering you. I'm just connecting the dots. If it's a real investment, show me the contract, the business plan, the receipts. If not, it's just spending. Susan yelled, pulling Natalie toward her as if to protect her. And what if she spent it? She's my daughter. I gave it to her. I looked directly at her. My voice was cutting. If you give your daughter your own money, no one says anything. But if you give her money from the fund that mostly your daughter-in-law contributed to, you have to be transparent. Ryan turned to his mother, his voice trembling with rage. Mom, why did you do this? Emily and I work, we put money into the fund, and you give it all to Natalie without consulting us. Susan slammed the table. Consult? I am the head of this family. Whatever I say goes. That phrase, I am the head of this family, left Ryan frozen. I saw in his eyes how, for the first time, he didn't see his mother as someone who cared for the family, but as someone who abused her power. Natalie started crying. But it was a calculated cry. Ryan, I had good intentions. I wanted to start a business so I wouldn't have to ask you guys for money. I interrupted her softly, but with the precision of a scalpel. So you wouldn't have to ask, but you take $12,000 in advance. Very smart. Natalie was left speechless and could only say, You're too strict. I answered instantly, Yes, I am strict when my money is used without my knowledge. Ryan looked at me with a mix of surprise and pain, he said quietly, as if confessing to himself. No, I didn't know. I didn't scold him. I just said a short sentence, enough for him to understand why I had reached this point. You didn't know, because you never wanted to know. Ryan lowered his head. Susan went back to her emotional tactic. Son, listen to me. Your wife is turning you against me. Ryan looked up with a hoarse voice. Mom, don't say anything else. I am looking at the proof. Silence took over the room. The TV was still on with the transfer on the screen. Natalie was hunched over. Susan was breathing heavily, and Ryan looked as if a blindfold had just been ripped off his eyes. I knew this was the moment I needed, not to humiliate anyone, but so my husband could never again say his usual, let it go. I disconnected the screen, left my phone on the table, and looked at them one by one with a voice as calm as steel. I will say it one more time so no one gets confused. Starting today, my money is managed by me. If the family fund continues to exist, it has to be transparent. Who contributes? How much? And what is it spent on? With receipts, the model of mom manages it and gives no explanations, while she takes thousands of dollars to give to her daughter, is over. I'm sorry, but I'm not participating in that. Susan tried to reply, but Ryan spoke first with a deep voice. Mom, you have to explain this. For the first time, Ryan didn't take his mother's side by default. I understood that once the truth was exposed like that, no one could hide it with tears or yelling. And from that moment I knew that the war in this house had moved to another front. Clearer, more intense, impossible to cover up with the word family. I looked at Ryan, then at Susan and Natalie, who formed a united front. I knew that ever since the $12,000 transfer appeared on the screen, any excuse of we are a family had crumbled, but just because it crumbled didn't mean they admitted their mistake. Someone like Susan, the more cornered she is, the louder she yells to silence the truth. And just as I expected, she took a deep breath and shifted to a high pitch, a mix of rage and bitterness. So what if I gave her $12,000? She is my daughter. Who else am I going to give it to? Why are you digging into this? I didn't answer immediately. I picked up the statements from the table and tapped them gently against the glass like a gavel. I said slowly, with every word so clear that no one could ignore it. If I had paid that $850 bill today, it would have been like agreeing to keep supporting this entire family. Ryan flinched. Maybe he didn't expect me to use the word supporting. Susan, as if gasoline had been thrown on a fire, screamed, "Insolent! You dare say we live off you?" I slapped the papers against the table with a sharp thud that made Natalie flinch. Insolent is taking other people's money without transparency. Insolent is spending your daughter-in-law's money and then calling her cheap. I replied without trembling. Natalie beside her started sobbing loudly, but her tears no longer softened me. Through her sobs, she accused me. "You only care about money. You're throwing it in our faces. No tears. No one forced you to give it. You gave it because you wanted to." I turned sharply toward her with an icy glare. Just that. $50,000 is just that. Natalie gasped, her mouth open, but without words. I knew that number. Said out loud. Wasn't to brag, but to expose her ingratitude. Ryan was motionless, like a statue. He had never stopped to add up what I had contributed. Hearing $50,000, his face darkened, as if the blindfold he wore to avoid seeing reality had been ripped off. He stammered, "Emily, you've contributed that much?" I didn't look at him with smugness, but with pity. Pity because the man I married had lived by my side for 4 years without knowing to what extent they were bleeding me dry. I said dryly, "You didn't know because you never asked." Susan, seeing Ryan waver, changed targets. She turned to him. Her voice was a hiss loaded with pressure. "Son, what are you doing just standing there? Are you going to let your wife trample all over your mother?" Ryan hesitated, but his gaze returned to the blank screen, to the statements on the table. He couldn't say his usual "let it go," and it was his silence that infuriated Susan even more. She lunged to snatch the papers from me, yelling, "Give me that! You bring these things to shame my family, you little brat?" I stepped back quickly, holding on to the papers. My voice was calm, but loaded with warning. "Don't touch them. They are evidence. The more you try to take them from me, the more it shows you are afraid." Natalie, no longer able to fake it, wiped her tears and adopted a biting tone. "You play the victim, but you've profited too. This house gave you a husband, a status." I let out a bitter laugh. "What status? That of an ATM?" Natalie, furious, shot back. "Who are you calling an ATM?" Whoever uses someone else's money as if it were their own considers that person an ATM, I replied. Susan slammed the table authoritatively. "Starting tomorrow, you bring me your salary like before. In this house, daughters-in-law don't keep their own money. Who do you think you are?" I stared at her without blinking. "I am the one who earns that money, and I keep my money." Susan yelled even louder. "You dare?" "I am not asking for permission," I replied without hesitation. That sentence made the room explode. Ryan was open-mouthed, Natalie petrified, and Susan was trembling with rage. She pointed her finger at me, almost brushing my face. Her voice cracked. You disrespect me." I tilted my head and told her directly, "It's not that I don't respect you. It's that you didn't respect me first. You considered my hard work as something you could take whenever you wanted and give to whoever you wanted." Susan turned to Ryan, seeking her last ally. "Ryan, say something. You are the man of the house. Are you going to let her walk all over your mother?" Ryan clenched his fists, his face red from the tension. He said with difficulty, as if swallowing every word, "Mom, you transferred $12,000 to Natalie without telling me." Susan interrupted him. "I did it for the family," Ryan replied, this time with more force. "Whose family?" That question was like a slap in the air. Natalie turned pale. It was the first time Ryan hadn't taken their side. She lunged with a sour voice. "Ryan, are you going to listen to her? She wants to divide the family." I looked at Natalie and told her directly, "No one divides a family more than the one who treats the others like an ATM." Natalie tried to continue, but I raised my hand to stop her with a firm voice. "Starting next month, I stop transferring money to the fund. Whoever wants a treat, pay for it themselves. Whoever wants designer bags, perfumes, or artisanal charcuterie, pay for it. If money is genuinely needed for the family, we sit down, we speak clearly, we plan, and we reach an agreement. Susan, as if she had gone crazy, screamed, "Do you plan on letting us starve to death?" I stared right at her. "This family won't starve to death without me. You've simply gotten used to living very well thanks to me." Ryan turned to me with a hoarse voice. "Emily, you are taking things too far." "Not taking them far would be a mistake," I replied. Then I looked at him and said something that left him in silence. "Do you prefer I keep paying so your house is at peace, or do you prefer your house to be at peace in a fair way?" No one answered. Everyone understood that this was no longer an argument about a supermarket purchase. It was a declaration of war. I was no longer asking for permission to be respected. I was drawing a line, and that line had just been drawn in the middle of the living room, so clearly that no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. After that night, my house turned into a freezer. Not because of the weather, but because of the coldness of the stairs, the footsteps, the clipped sentences thrown like darts. Susan and Natalie didn't yell at me anymore, but their silence wasn't a truce. It was the calm before the storm. I lived in a house where every meal was a wordless interrogation. Natalie would walk past me as if I were invisible. If I asked her something as simple as, "Have you eaten yet?" she wouldn't answer. She'd simply lift her chin and turn around. Susan resorted to her usual tactic, passive-aggressive comments. She would speak loudly so the neighbors would hear, but with the intention of it reaching me. One morning, opening the door, I heard her tell the neighbor over the fence, "Daughters-in-law today are terrible. As soon as they get some money, they despise their husband's family." The neighbor murmured something, and I, standing in my house, squeezed the doorknob, wondering if I lived in a family or on a stage set up to humiliate me. Ryan was quieter than ever. He no longer yelled at me like the first day, but he didn't clearly take my side either. He seemed like a man split in two, with his mother on one side and his wife on the other, and he chose not to choose. I would look at him and sometimes want to say, "Be a man for once," but then I kept quiet because I understood the decision no longer depended on my words, but on how far the truth would go. 2 days passed like that. I went to work, came home, and submerged myself in that dense atmosphere. I didn't look for a fight, but I didn't yield either. I held the line I had drawn. I didn't wire money to the fund. I didn't buy anything for Natalie or Susan, and it was then that I realized something. The moment you stop giving, you become the enemy. On the third day, while I was at the office, my desk phone rang. It was the internal credit department of the bank. I recognized a coworker's voice, but she sounded serious. "Emily, do you have a minute? I wanted to confirm something. There's a loan application for $20,000 in your name in the system. When did you apply for it?" I thought I misheard. What did you say? A $20,000 loan?" I asked. My voice had gone hoarse. She answered firmly, "Yes, the file was just approved and is about to move to the verification phase. Please review it, because we've seen some points that need clarification." I froze. The pen dropped from my hand. $20,000. It was no joke. I had never applied for that loan. I hadn't signed any document of that kind recently. I swallowed hard and told my coworker, "Wait, give me the file number. I'll check it right now." With the number, I logged into the system. My heart beat with the force of a hammer, and there it was, like a slap in the face. The complete file with my personal data, my address, my phone number, even copies of my IDs. In the signature section, the signature looked so much like mine that at first glance, anyone would pass it off as real. But I knew it wasn't my signature. The strokes were forced. It lacked the curved ending I always did. I felt a chill. It wasn't fear of the money, but of something much worse. Someone was using my identity to do something very serious. I tried to stay calm. I asked my boss for permission to step out for a moment. I went to the restroom, and, standing in front of the mirror, I saw my pale face. I asked myself, who could do something like this? Who has access to all my documents? Who knows my signature? And the answer appeared so clearly that it made me nauseous. In that house, the only person who kept copies of my ID, my birth certificate, my marriage license, those things that Mom keeps so it's more convenient, was Susan. I remembered all the times she had told me, "Give the papers to me, you'll just lose them." I trusted her. I had handed them over. I could have become a debtor of $20,000 without even knowing it. I returned to my desk, requested a copy of the loan file, as internal regulations permitted. I asked my credit coworker to let me print the signature section and the IDs. Seeing my face, she asked quietly what was wrong. I didn't tell her everything. I just said, "I need a copy to verify this. I did not apply for this loan." My coworker was surprised, but acted with discretion. "Resolve it quickly, Emily. This can have legal consequences." I walked out of the bank with the papers in my hand, as heavy as a tombstone. I didn't run home in a panic. I didn't call screaming. I knew that if I lost my cool, they would accuse me of making it up. I needed to be lucid, to face it the right way. When I got home, I opened the door. There was a strange silence. Susan was sitting in the living room as if waiting for me. Natalie was looking at her phone, and Ryan hadn't arrived yet. I walked straight to the table. I dropped the file with a sharp thud that echoed in the quiet room. Susan looked up, looked at the papers, and then at me with the same expression of someone used to being in control. Natalie jumped and turned off her phone screen. I stared at Susan. My voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut off any retreat. "Did you use my name to apply for a loan?" The question dropped like a stone. Susan froze for an instant. Natalie's eyes went wide. For a moment, no one said anything, and in that instant, I knew with certainty that this was no longer a story about a supermarket or forgotten wallets or humiliations. This was a legal matter, and if they had done it, the price they would have to pay wouldn't be settled with apologies. Susan recovered and shook her head. Her voice went high-pitched like a victim's. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm an older woman. What would I know about loans?" As she spoke, she put her hand to her chest, acting as if she were being insulted. Natalie, beside her, was stiff, blinking nonstop, clinging to her phone as if she feared the truth would slip through her fingers. I didn't argue. I pulled a sheet from the file, placed it in front of Susan, and pointed to the signature. "Look closely. This is a signature with my name on it." Susan glanced at it out of the corner of her eye and looked away. "Even if I look at it, I don't understand anything. Go ask the bank." I raised my voice. For the first time in my life, I used that tone with my mother-in-law, because I knew if I was soft, they would deny everything. "I am asking you because you are the only one who keeps my documents. No one else in this house has them." Susan changed tactics and started yelling to intimidate me. "I keep your papers so you don't lose them, and this is how you repay me? What a daughter-in-law." I looked at her. My calm was freezing. "If you keep them, you better keep them well. Because if my documents are in your possession and now a $20,000 loan appears in my name, you have to give me an explanation." Natalie shifted as if trying to slip away. I glared at her and she froze. I flipped another page and slid it toward her. "Here is the cosigner." Natalie looked at the paper and all the color drained from her face. In the file, in the cosigners section, was her name, her ID number, and her signature. They weren't rumors or guesses. It was right there in black and white, Natalie stammered. "This!" Susan jumped, and turning to her, hissed through her teeth. "What have you done?" Natalie fell silent. Her eyes darted from side to side. Susan, who had just denied knowing anything, upon seeing her daughter's name, reacted like someone who was fully aware. Seeing the scene, I felt a deep chill, not because of the money, but because of how far they had dared to go. The supermarket trick was just a rehearsal. The real hit was this $20,000. Just at that moment, Ryan walked in. Seeing the tense atmosphere and the file on the table, he stopped. "What's going on here?" I didn't beat around the bush. I pointed to the papers and said a single sentence. "Look for yourself." Ryan picked them up and started flipping through them. As he read, his face grew paler. When he got to the part where Natalie was listed as a cosigner, his hands shook. He looked up, staring at his mother and his sister. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Mom, Natalie, what is this?" Susan took the opportunity to continue her act. "I don't know anything. She came in with those papers and is accusing me." Ryan turned to me with a mix of panic and pleading in his eyes. "Emily, calm down. Surely it's a misunderstanding." I interrupted him. My voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. There is no misunderstanding when there is a forged signature on a loan file. There is no misunderstanding when the co-signer is Natalie. I stared right at Ryan and asked him a question that left him petrified. Do you want us to handle this in-house, or do I call the police? The question dropped like a hammer. Ryan went pale. His lips moved, but he couldn't speak. In that moment, I saw true fear in his eyes. Not fear of my anger, but fear that a family issue would cross the threshold of the house and become a criminal case. Natalie panicked, jumped up, and approached, sobbing. Sister-in-law, don't make a drama out of this. It was just a temporary loan. As soon as I had the money, I'd pay it back. I looked at her without a shred of pity. To borrow, you ask? You don't forge a signature. Natalie cried harder, grabbing my arm. Sister-in-law, please. It was a mistake. Mom told me to do it. She said you'd surely never find out. Hearing that, Susan yelled, Shut up. What kind of stupid things are you saying? I turned to her with a bitter smile. You just said you didn't know anything, and now you tell Natalie to shut up. So, did you know or not? Susan was breathing heavily, her eyes bulging, no longer having the composure to keep acting. Ryan, in the middle of it all, was as white as a sheet, looking at his mother and sister as if he had just discovered he lived in a house where the truth could be manipulated at any moment. I didn't let the situation devolve into a brawl. I took out my phone and opened my messaging app with a draft ready for the bank's fraud department. My finger hovered over the send button. I said, with every word as clear as a bell, I have already verified in the system that this file has a fraudulent signature. If I send this message, the bank will initiate an internal investigation, and if there is evidence of a crime, they will escalate the case according to procedure. And then no one will be able to ask to just let it go. Ryan lunged and instinctively grabbed my wrist. His voice was almost a plea. I looked at him, and my gaze was no longer that of the docile wife trying to save her marriage. I asked him directly, past the point of no return. Do you choose to defend your mother and sister, or do you choose justice? Ryan opened his mouth, but couldn't answer. Susan was petrified, and Natalie was crying uncontrollably. The room plunged into a suffocating silence. I kept my hand still under Ryan's, but my finger kept hovering over the send button. I wasn't shaking. I just had one thing clear. If I pressed that button, everything would blow up, and then no one could ever use the word family to cover up a felony. I looked at Ryan for a few more seconds and then gently pulled his hand off my wrist. It wasn't because I had stopped loving my husband, but because I understood that if I caved today, tomorrow they would do it again, only more cunningly. I set the phone on the table. My voice was calm but firm. All right, I won't send it now, but I will follow protocol. Ryan thought I was caving. His face relaxed a bit, but my next sentence left him frozen. Tomorrow morning, I'll take a few hours off. I will invite the credit and verification staff to come to the house to verify the signature in person. Ryan, horrified, exclaimed, Are you crazy? Inviting strangers into the house? This is a family matter. We fix it ourselves. I looked him in the eyes and asked him a single question. Are you afraid of losing face, or of the truth being discovered? Ryan was left speechless. Susan, as if someone had stepped on her tail, screamed, Don't you dare. Doing that, you just want to humiliate me in front of everyone. I didn't yell. I simply said calmly, Whether there is humiliation or not depends on you. I didn't sign it, so I am not going to pay the debt. If you keep denying it, then we will need an expert to verify it. Natalie started crying and clung to Ryan. Ryan, say something. If not, I'm ruined. Ryan pulled away. For the first time, I saw in his eyes a mix of pity and fear toward his sister. Fear because he understood that if the loan was real, they wouldn't just drag me down, he would be implicated too. I didn't want to turn Ryan into my enemy. I just wanted him to stop being the rug his mother and sister walked on to trample me. That night I barely slept. I didn't cry. I stared at the ceiling, telling myself I had to keep a cool head. The next morning I got up early, called my internal credit coworker, and concisely explained the situation. I suspect my signature was forged on a loan file in my name. I am requesting that a verification team come to my home to cross-check the signature in person, per protocol. On the other end of the line, her tone turned serious. Emily, this is delicate, but if you confirm you didn't sign it, we have to act. I nodded. I stand by my words. Around 10 inches the morning, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, 2 bank employees, a man and a woman, with their badges. Good morning, Mrs. Emily. We are here to assist in verifying the file. As requested, I invited them in. Seeing the strangers, Susan, who was in the living room, adopted a sweet tone, as if she were the nicest person in the world. Oh, if there is a misunderstanding, we can talk about it as a family. There was no need to bother these young people. I placed a glass of water on the table for the employees and, turning to her, said a single sentence. We've spent 4 years talking as a family, and you still treat me like an ATM. Now we need witnesses. Ryan, beside me, whispered. Emily, are you crossing the line? I looked at him. My voice was low but sharp. Crossing the line is forging a signature, not verifying it. Ryan fell quiet. Natalie was huddled in a corner of the sofa with red eyes, looking at the employees as if they were the police. The female employee opened a folder. Mrs. Emily, please sign here 3 times so we can compare it with the signature on the file. I nodded. I signed without hesitation. The employee compared the signatures right then and there. In a matter of seconds, their expressions changed. Mrs. Emily, the sample signature and the one on the file show notable differences. The stroke and the ending do not match. I took a deep breath, not out of joy, but because the truth finally had a voice. I took out my phone and showed them some pictures. I took these pictures the day I discovered that the drawer where my mother-in-law kept my documents had been rummaged through. I have the habit of photographing important things, and I suspected someone had been digging. The atmosphere in the room was so tense, you could hear the sound of the pen on the paper. Susan could no longer keep up the act. She jumped up with a sour voice. What an evil daughter-in-law. She wants to put her mother-in-law in jail. Don't listen to her. She's making it all up. I stared at her. My voice didn't waver. You reap what you sow. I didn't sign it, so I won't carry the debt. Susan pointed at me, trembling with rage. You dare? You forget you are living in my house. I live on my salary, not on forged signatures. Ryan tried to mediate with the employees. Maybe we can handle this in the family. The employee maintained his professionalism. I'm sorry, but fraud verification is a mandatory procedure. If the client confirms she didn't sign, we must escalate the case to the fraud department. Hearing the word fraud, Susan's face went pale, and Natalie shrank even further. Ryan turned to me, almost begging, Emily, let's fix this ourselves. Let's not make this any bigger. I looked at him with icy eyes and told him what he needed to hear. Fixing it ourselves means continuing to cover it up, right? Cover it up to keep the peace at home while I carry the debt for the rest of my life. Ryan couldn't answer. He lowered his head as if, for the first time, he understood the price of silence. Before leaving, the employee informed us that I had to report to the branch for further verifications and that the case would go to the legal department. When they left, I heard Susan let out a sigh, as if she had been drained of all her strength. Natalie collapsed on the sofa. Ryan, in the middle of the living room, looked at me as if he wanted to apologize, but couldn't. I knew that ever since those 2 employees walked into the house, everything had surpassed Susan and Natalie's capacity for manipulation. And just as I wanted, the truth no longer depended on anyone's word. It was in a file, in a procedure, and soon in the hands of the legal department. As soon as the bank employees left, the house, which I had hoped would calm down, became the stage for the next performance. Susan is not one to accept defeat. I was putting away the file when I heard noise at the door. Relatives were arriving, my husband's whole family. Susan, in the middle of the room, had already started her act, crying loudly so everyone could hear her. My daughter-in-law and my son are treating me like an enemy. They brought the bank to the house to humiliate me. They want to corner me. As the door opened, aunts and cousins looked at me as if I were a criminal. Natalie, beside her, added fuel to the fire. She wants to throw us out on the street to keep Ryan all to herself. She made up the loan thing to blame my mom. One aunt, always the nosiest, pointed at me. A daughter-in-law like that should be thrown out. I, standing in the middle of them all, no longer felt anger, only a profound coldness. A coldness, seeing how easy it is to believe the one who cries the loudest, regardless of the truth. Ryan, beside me, was tense, trapped. Susan pressured him. "Your wife wants to kill your mother." I didn't enter the argument. I knew it would be useless. I pulled out my phone. "Mom, why did you call them? To force me to stay quiet or to make me the guilty one? You are guilty!" she screamed. I pressed the play button. Natalie's voice, laughing, filled the living room. "Let Emily pay. She won't dare to do anything." Silence fell. Susan, pale, tried to counterattack. "Recording your family is evil." "Evil is forging a signature to take out a loan," I replied. The murmurs grew. "What loan?" Susan denied everything. Natalie, back in her victim role, cried, "She made it up to hurt us." I looked at Natalie with a calm that surprised even me. But then she took a step forward, pulled out a printed piece of paper, and held it up as if it were irrefutable proof. "She's the one in debt. She made all this up to cover her own mess." I looked at the paper. It was a crude forgery. If I had panicked, I would have lost. But I didn't. I stepped closer, looked at Natalie, and then at everyone else. My voice was icy. "All right, let's get a handwriting expert. Whoever is lying faces the consequences." Natalie froze. She didn't expect me to be unafraid. Susan looked around for an exit. Ryan went pale, understanding that if that paper was fake, his mother and sister were sinking even deeper. I whispered to him, "You see, they don't just want to force me to pay, they want to make me the guilty one." The family tribunal Susan had assembled to corner me had become her own trap because just by accepting a verification, her lies would become evidence against her. And I knew that from the moment Natalie held up that paper, the game had changed. Now, whoever lied would pay the price. After my proposal to get an expert, the room fell silent. The relatives were no longer speaking with such certainty. I settled the matter. Right now, words are useless. Let's go to the bank branch with the fraud department, cameras, and procedures. We'll know who is telling the truth. Shortly after, I was in the car with Ryan and Natalie, heading to the bank. Walking in, the atmosphere was different. There was no room for tears or accusations there, only evidence. They took us to a room with cameras. A man from the legal department got straight to the point. "Ma'am, do you confirm that the signature on the $20,000 loan file in your name has been forged?" "Yes," I replied, "and I request an investigation." He turned to Natalie and Ryan. The head of security played a security camera recording. You could see a person wearing a cap and mask handing over the papers. The posture, the way she held the pen, it was familiar. Ryan stared at the screen, his face dropping. He turned to Natalie. "It's you! It's you!" Natalie jumped out of the chair. "It's not me," the legal department man said coldly. "If you say it isn't you, we can request a handwriting and voice analysis. Think about it carefully." Natalie, terrified, tried to deflect. I just accompanied my mom." Ryan grabbed her arm. "Tell the truth." And in that moment of panic, Natalie blurted out the phrase that revealed everything. "I only signed for her. What's wrong with that?" Dead silence. Ryan stood petrified. His face went from shock to humiliation. The legal guy looked up. "You just admitted you forged her signature." Natalie covered her mouth. "Too late." I turned to Ryan. "I only signed for her. What do you think I've been to them these 4 years?" Ryan's phone rang. It was his mother. He stepped out to talk, but I heard her hissing voice. "Son, protect the family. Don't let this get out." When he came back, he was pale. The legal rep concluded that if the situation wasn't resolved and the damage repaired, the case would be handed over to the authorities. Hearing that, Natalie burst into tears. Ryan collapsed into the chair. I looked at the lawyer. "I don't want pity. I want my rights protected." In that moment, I knew Ryan had finally understood that his family, if not stopped, would drag them all into the mud. and I no longer had any reason to let myself be dragged down. On the way back home, the silence in the car was absolute. Ryan seemed like a robot. That night he came home late. He stood at the door as if he didn't know how to walk in. "Emily," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I never imagined they'd go this far." I didn't answer. I went to my room, pulled out a suitcase, and opened it. "What? What are you doing?" he asked, alarmed. I pulled out an envelope and put it on the table. Inside were the divorce papers and an itemized list of all the money I had contributed to the family. "How long have you been preparing this?" he asked with a broken voice. I looked right at him. "Since I realized you would never protect me." "It's not true," he begged. "I'll change. I'll tell Mom to move out. I'll manage the money." "I won't let Natalie." I interrupted him. "You're only changing because you're afraid of losing me. Where were you while I was enduring it?" At that moment, the door burst open. Susan walked in screaming, "If you get a divorce, you leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. You gave the money voluntarily." I pulled out my phone and played another recording. Her own cold voice. "The money in the fund belongs to the daughter-in-law. It's her duty to contribute." Susan was left speechless. Ryan looked at her, then at me, then at the divorce papers. His eyes filled with a painful realization. For the first time, he stepped between his mother and me when she tried to lunge forward. "Enough, Mom!" he yelled. I didn't feel any victory. I just knew I no longer belonged in that house. I packed my suitcase calmly, taking my documents and the essentials. "Are you really leaving?" Ryan asked, devastated. "I'm not leaving out of anger," I replied. "I'm leaving because I don't trust you anymore." I rolled my suitcase out of that house on a cold night. I didn't cry. I felt empty, as if a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Days later, the bank resolved the matter. My mother-in-law and Natalie had to take on the debt and sign an agreement. Natalie was flagged in the credit risk system. I didn't feel satisfaction, only relief at not having to carry other people's debts. Ryan came to see me. "Give me a chance," he asked with red eyes. I answered him calmly. "I gave you 4 years, and you used them to stay silent." He confessed that he knew his mother used my money, but thought it was a family thing. "Family," I told him, "is not an excuse for the strong to abuse the weak." Susan called me too, sometimes to insult me, sometimes to cry, and ask me to come back. "Mistakes are fixed with actions, not tears," I told her before hanging up. I moved into a small apartment, simple but peaceful. I managed my own money, cooked what I felt like eating, lived my own life. Sometimes I looked at the supermarket receipt. That $850 wasn't about the money, it was about the attitude of disrespect, the certainty that I had to pay that bill. It reminded me that if I had given in that day, today I would be paying off much larger debts. People don't become abusive out of nowhere. They do it because they think you won't dare to react. They manipulate you because they think your fear of shame, of what people will say, of breaking up the family, is stronger. And sometimes, that fear is the strongest chain. Ryan, caught between his mother and his wife, finally understood that the one who yells the loudest doesn't have the right to be right, but rather the one who has the truth. A truth he ignored for far too long. The last time he came, before leaving, he asked me, "Do you still love me?" I stayed quiet for a moment and then answered honestly, "Love doesn't vanish in a day, but you can't live on love alone while enduring the unendurable." He nodded, as if accepting a truth he should have seen much earlier. Sometimes turning your back isn't revenge. It's simply a way to start living your own life without anyone else forging it for you.